A very warm welcome, everybody, to Norwich Castle this evening for the third in the series of our research seminar events. Shipwreck and the Sea in Early Modern Art and Culture, New Horizons and Watery Graves. Before we start, I'll just give you a few bits of housekeeping. There isn't a fire practice scheduled for this evening, so if the fire alarm does go, it is a real event, so we will need to file out of the TCA either that way or that way. And but hopefully that won't happen and we can sit and enjoy our seminar. A bit of a plug for our final event in the series, which is Tuesday, July the 11th, and that is Stuart Style Textiles from the Gloucester. And speaking at that will be Maria Hayward, Professor of History, University of Southampton, Ninia Michaela, Historical Costumier, and Ruth Battersby, the Senior Curator of Costume and Textiles here at Norwich Castle and one of our fellow curators on the exhibition. This event is fully booked in person, so if you haven't already booked your place, you have to see a member of staff in the rotunda to be put on the waiting list. Tonight's event will also be live streamed and you can watch it at your convenience on the UEA Public Engagements YouTube channel. Finally, I should apologise. We've had a mix-up with the staffing arrangements this evening, which has meant that the drinks reception had to be before the event rather than after, because we actually need to close the building earlier than we had hoped. So many apologies for that. But I hope that those of you who have had a glass of wine have enjoyed it. Anyhow, without further ado, I will introduce our first wonderful speaker for this evening, Dr. Carl Thompson, and he will be speaking tonight on the cultural and political meanings of shipwrecks and the sea under the later Stuarts. Carl joined Surrey University in 2017, September 2017, having previously been at St Mary's University, Twickenham. Before that, Carl was reader in English literature and travel culture at Nottingham Trent, and from 2000 to 2003, junior research fellow in English at Trinity College, Oxford. He completed his DPhil at Oxford University in 2001, which became the basis of his first book, The Suffering Traveller and the Romantic Imagination. Since then, he has published widely over a range of research areas. He's the author of Travel Writing in 2011, and more recently edited the Routledge Companion to Travel Writing in 2016. His main research focus on recent years has been on the women travel writers in the 18th and 19th centuries, and he has just completed a scholarly edition of Jemima Kindersley's Letters from Tenerife, Brazil, to Cape of Good Hope and the East Indies in 1777, and Maria Graham's Journal of a Residence in India of 1812 for the Chawton House Library Taylor and Francis series Women's Travel Writings in India. He's currently completing a monograph on Maria Graham for Oxford University Press. He also maintains an interest in maritime culture and the literary depiction of the sea in this period, with particular focus on representations of shipwreck. His principal publications in this area have been two edited collections, one of primary materials, Romantic Era Shipwreck Narratives, an anthology, 2007, and one of critical reflections, Shipwreck in Art and Literature, Images and Interpretations from Antiquity to the Present Day, in 2013. So, Carl, welcome.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, sounds like the mic is working. Yeah, thank you very much, Francesca. Thank you, Claire, Benjamin, Sophie and Molly, for inviting me and organising the trip. Right, yeah, so I'm going to talk on wrecks in print. Later, Elsje is going to talk about shipwrecks in art, amongst other topics. It's a pairing that perhaps puts me at a bit of a disadvantage because you know the old adage about a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that may be so, but the starting premise for my talk really is that almost every picture we look at comes to us framed by or informed by many thousands of words. Pictures, paintings, drawings, photographs, it's rare that we look at any visual image without its subject matter activating in us a host of already known stories and ideas about that scene or topic. These sort of prior narratives help us make sense of and respond to visual images. They create the associations and assumptions we bring to bear on pictures. They establish reference points that visual artists can variously invoke or play against in their individual handling of a theme. All of this holds true whether we are looking at a picture of a sports car, a famous person, iconic location, or indeed our topic today, a shipwreck. I'm sure for all of us here, when we look at an image like this of the wreck of the Gloucester, we find that that evocative topic, that evocative word, shipwreck, will conjure in us all sorts of associations and stories. And later in the Q&A, I'll be very interested in hearing what comes to your minds when you hear this word shipwreck. What stories does it bring to your minds? But my aim first is to convey something of the stories that would have come to people's minds in the late 17th and 18th centuries when shipwreck was mentioned. This was, after all, a period when shipwrecks were pretty much weekly, if not daily, occurrences, both around the coasts of Britain and in more far-flung locations. And as we'll shortly see, accounts of these wrecks circulated in multiple forms in British culture. And I think we can safely assume that everyone in this period was, as I put it in my title, shipwreck literate, i.e. they were familiar with lots of different wrecks. Yet, as I'll go on to suggest, this didn't just make them very knowledgeable about shipwrecks. If you look at the material they were consuming, I think it's also clear that they were absorbing a sort of mythology around maritime disasters and a sort of mythic master narrative about what was likely to happen in the event of a wreck. And it's this mythology I'm going to suggest that we need to factor in if we're trying to assess the sort of narrative framing attendant when people looked at a picture like this back when it was first produced. Firstly, however, some context. People were very familiar with lots of wrecks in the late 17th and 18th centuries, basically because there were lots of wrecks. About 1 in 10 sea voyages in the late 17th century, it's been estimated, ended in disaster. By the early 19th century, one contemporary assessment put the number of Britons losing their lives at sea each year at around 5,000, more than double the number of people dying on British roads in recent years, but from a population 6 times smaller than the UK modern population. So many people's lives were touched directly or indirectly by shipwreck in the long 18th century, and perhaps just as importantly, many people's livelihoods were affected. The number of shipwrecks was escalating because Britain's maritime trade was escalating across the period, and the loss of ships at sea was often not just a personal tragedy for those with family members involved, but also an issue of public economic concern. Maritime disasters might also have important strategic implications. This was, after all, a period when Britain was hugely dependent on its navy, both for the defence of its own shores and for the defence of its merchant fleets around the world. All of these factors ensured that people not just from maritime communities but from all walks of life took a keen interest in shipwrecks. And that interest was well catered to due to the fact that what academics like to call print culture was also expanding rapidly in this period. Literacy rates were rising, newspapers and in due course magazines were becoming staples of British life. More people than ever before were reading for both pleasure and information. All of which meant that this period didn't just see an escalating number of wrecks, it also saw an ever-escalating number, indeed a veritable flood, of written accounts of shipwreck. And that's what we're going to explore a little bit in my talk. So the first step in the recounting and, as it were, the textual rendering of a shipwreck was usually newspaper reporting. Newspaper reports could range from simple notices that information had been received, that such and such a ship had been lost or was now thought lost, to more detailed eyewitnesses' accounts of sequence of events in a specific disaster. One also sometimes rather hauntingly finds, in my reading of shipwrecks from this period, haunting sort of notices that simply that wreckage has been found, washed up somewhere or drifting at sea. No one knows where it's come from, but there's obviously been a wreck and no one can identify what it comes from. And I always thought you might be interested to learn that a bit later we get a very interesting vignette of what it was like to read about these wrecks when Anna Barbauld writes about sort of wives and family members at home reading of the fate of husbands, brothers and friends in the newspaper, and then having to go to the atlas to find out where these locations are that they are supposed to have been wrecked on, because they're wrecked on the other side of the world and no one really knows where they're being shipwrecked. So newspaper reports were the first voyage into print, if you like, of a shipwreck. Alongside newspaper reports, some wrecks gave rise to another popular form of publication in this period, the broadside. These were typically cheaply produced accounts printed on just one side of a large sheet of paper, Often they incorporate, as you can see here, crude woodcuts or similar illustrations. And it's also very common for them to offer both a prose description of the wreck and an accompanying ballad or poem about the wreck. As again, as you can see in these examples, there's a main body of prose, and then there's a section of prose and a section in verse. One presumes that sometimes the verse sections were recited to listeners, possibly even set to music, so that news of the wreck in this way would have also reached audiences who couldn't read. This often hastily produced, highly ephemeral material also conveys well, I think, the way in which a major shipwreck, or a wreck which was especially noteworthy for some reason, was often not just a matter of commercial concern for many people, it could also represent a considerable commercial opportunity. Many broadsides like these are clearly attempts to cash in on public interest in a recent wreck, and that money-making agenda clearly strongly influences the tone of the account and the sort of details they tend to foreground. As you can see from these headlines, there's a strong leaning towards the lurid and sensationalistic. There's a lot of blood and gore, and in some cases, almost a sort of horror story element to these broadside retellings of maritime disaster. That horror story element also runs strongly through the next important category of publication that typically followed a major wreck. These are the chapbook accounts of a shipwreck. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, a chapbook is in effect a sort of pamphlet, typically running to 24 or 36 pages, and they're usually quite small pages. And that length allowed a more extended account of a wreck than you get in newspaper reporting, but it's still much shorter and much cheaper to produce than a full book-length account. I should stress that the top picture doesn't actually show a set of shipwreck-themed chapbooks, but it was the only image I could find which gives you a sense of how chapbooks originally looked when they were first published and the sort of size of them. They circulated in, again, this sort of pamphlet form, and they're a very popular part of the publishing landscape in the late 17th and 18th and even early 19th centuries. In this connection, it's also worth noting that major or noteworthy wrecks typically didn't just produce a single chapbook account. Very commonly, they produced multiple competing chapbooks about the disaster. The reasons for this were again partly commercial. As with broadsides, printers and publishers often wanted to cash in on public interest in a big wreck, and one way to do this was to find an eyewitness, or better still, survivor, whose perspective on the wreck hadn't yet been heard, and then put their perspective in print. This is another important aspect worth noting about shipwreck accounts in chapbook form. Although it wasn't invariably the case, chapbooks usually offered first-person testimonies rather than third-person reportage, as was more common in newspaper and broadside renderings of a wreck. And then this first-person testimony element was in turn another factor in the proliferation of multiple chapbook accounts of an individual wreck. Producing these texts was partly, as I've said, a commercial enterprise. At the same time, however, there could also be an important justificatory component in publishing a shipwreck chapbook. As with any major disaster, commentators and the wider public were often keen to apportion blame and culpability in the aftermath of a wreck. Who was at fault for the tragedy? The captain, the pilot, perhaps the workmen and overseers at the depot who had poorly fitted out the ship for its voyage, perhaps the investors and shareholders who had cut corners and refused to equip the vessel properly, or perhaps it was the incompetence of a particular seaman or the general unruliness of an insubordinate crew. These were questions people liked to pick over in the aftermath of a wreck, and defending oneself from accusations of culpability and or deflecting such accusations onto someone else was often an important motivation for producing a chapbook account of the wreck. In arguing out these issues of blame and responsibility, the debates that typically followed a major wreck often became political in nature. This is arguably a tendency to some extent discernible in the aftermath of any sort of disaster in any period. However, the way larger political considerations often get woven into 17th and 18th century shipwreck debates probably also owes something to what was at this stage still a very potent and pervasive piece of political rhetoric and imagery, that of the ship of state. This is, of course, a metaphor that still gets invoked occasionally today by speechmakers, columnists, cartoonists, and such like, but it was understandably much more prevalent in the political discourse of the period under discussion here, when, as mentioned earlier, Britain's prosperity and security was conspicuously rooted in its maritime endeavours. These metaphoric associations then often get reflected back onto real ships and shipwrecks, so that the latter start to be read and interpreted as allegories for the state of the nation as a whole, and as evidence of whatever deplorable tendency or development of the day a commentator wants to attack. Perhaps one of the most clear-cut examples of this is the wreck that brings us all here today, that of the Gloucester in 1682, where, as Claire has shown in her article, the then Duke of York, the future James II, had to work hard to try to control the narrative around the wreck so that it didn't become entrenched in the public's imagination as evidence of incompetent leadership. Another example that illustrates this tendency from a slightly different angle would be the debates that often occurred in the aftermath of a major East Indiaman wreck, such as the wrecks of the Doddington, Grosvenor or Halswell in 1755, 1782 and 1786 respectively. The term East Indiaman refers to the fact that these were the trading vessels of the East India Company, the huge private trading corporation that was in the process across the long 18th century of establishing a vast empire in India. But there were many contemporaries who felt that the East India Company exercised a malign, corrupting influence both in India and back in Britain. Therefore, when tragedy befell an East Indiaman and its passengers and crew, the accounts that subsequently recounted the wreck usually had to position themselves either for or against the East India Company and what it was felt to represent, i.e. empire building abroad, and at home growing commercialism and consumerism, and in the eyes of some, the corporate catcher of the British political elite. So these are all sort of state-of-the-nation political debates that often swirled around and got woven in to chapbook accounts of shipwreck. As well as generating disputes over their political implications, shipwrecks, or more specifically, the literature shipwrecks generated, could also occasion arguments over religion. The period under discussion here inherited from earlier eras not only the long-standing ship of state metaphor, but also an equally long-standing association between maritime disasters and diverse forms of divine intervention. In Old Testament Judaism and in earlier medieval Christianity, the open sea and the ocean were generally depicted as the most terrifying and chaotic of realms. Survival in this hostile, monster-filled environment was assumed to be largely beyond human control and in the hands of God alone, a framing of seafaring and seafaring narratives that somewhat paradoxically caused some people to seek them out precisely because they might reveal, or ideally ought to reveal, evidences of divine protection. Or as the psalm puts it more poetically, those who go down to the sea in ships, who do business on great waters, they see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. Just as the ship of state featured frequently in political discourse, therefore, the motif of the dangerous sea voyage and the providential avoidance or survival of shipwreck was a staple of religious discourse in the period under consideration here, featuring in many sermons and homilies. These religious expectations then sometimes informed both the writing and reading of real-life shipwreck accounts, with some authors seeking to identify the workings of providence in relation to a specific disaster, and some readers being outraged if an account did not emphasise the religious lessons they felt were taught by the wreck. Yet this religious tendency in the narration of shipwreck amongst some authors and readers might in turn provoke the ire of more sceptical or secular authors and readers who found it heavy-handed, distasteful, even exploitative to shoehorn religious explanations into tragic events that could just as easily be explained in a more rational, naturalistic way. So this became another battleground, as it were, that often emerged in the retrospective narration and memorialisation of wrecks, with authors and accounts again often contesting what they felt were problematic earlier accounts. In all these different ways, then, what one often encounters in the aftermath of a major wreck in this period is a sort of struggle for the meaning of that wreck and a contestation of rival ways of interpreting the disaster. I like to think of it as shipwrecks in this period. They don't tend to generate consensus, they generate dissensus, in which people all fall out about what the wreck means and how we should understand it. I've discussed this dissensus element to shipwreck accounts in relation to chapbooks, because the latter seem to me the medium where this disputation is most obvious and explicit, because of often the first-person testimony element of these accounts. But it's worth just saying that different political and philosophical framings of a disaster and the harnessing of a wreck to larger political or cultural disputes were also sometimes, of course, evident in the newspaper reports and broadside renderings I discussed a little while ago. Similar disputation and side-taking then also runs through the further category of shipwreck account I've indicated on this slide, which are the numerous accounts that appear in magazines, journals, and other periodicals. I've put these next to chapbook accounts because that's often exactly what they are. Accounts originally published as chapbooks, which magazine editors then filch and pirate for their own publication, almost certainly without permission or any sort of financial reimbursement for the original author. And these sort of shipwreck narratives in magazines then become a sort of staple page filler for periodicals throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, being frequently recycled and reprinted on the flimsiest of pretexts, and usually with little in the way of editorial commentary. If in doubt, or shorter material, stick a shipwreck in. That seems to have been the motto of a lot of 18th and 19th century editors. Okay, so I'm aware of time ticking on, so I'm just quickly going to talk about mention two other categories, we'll come back, of publication which are part of the sort of literary landscape around shipwreck. One are the many poems that often appeared either in magazines, like the bottom example there, or sometimes if they were long enough as standalone pamphlets and chapbooks commemorating particular wrecks. And then the second one I'm going to mention are the book-length accounts that did sometimes appear. So here you can see the frontispieces to 3 books that came out of the 1741 Wager wreck, a major naval disaster whose after effects would include some significant changes to naval regulations and naval practices. And here the point I was making about the disputatious nature of chapbook accounts also applies. The Wager generates multiple books because culpability for the disaster and its aftermath was disputed, with the petty officers Bulkley and Cummins, authors of the account in the top left there, needing to demonstrate that they hadn't mutinied in the aftermath of the wreck. And then later John Byron, a midshipman on the Wager and subsequently grandfather of the famous Lord Byron, John Byron wrote ostensibly to argue the captain's case in this dispute. Though if you read it, the support he gives the captain is actually pretty lukewarm. And so if anyone's interested, I've got a copy of Byron's account here. This is if anyone wants to have a look at the sort of form they actually appeared in. Such book-length accounts of shipwreck are, of course, comparatively expensive to produce and to purchase, and so aren't that common in the 18th century. But a form of book-length publication that does become very common from about 1800 is the shipwreck anthology. Here are some examples. These have antecedents in earlier years. In 1675, for example, there appeared posthumously Mr. James Way's Legacy to His Friends, containing 27 instances of God's providence in and about sea dangers and deliverances. Janeway was a Puritan minister, and as the title of this collection suggests, his anthology stands squarely in that tradition of religious interpretations of shipwreck that I mentioned earlier. However, the publication which really launches the vogue among publishers for shipwreck anthologies is Archibald Duncan's The Mariner's Chronicle, being a collection of narratives of shipwreck, fire, famine, and other calamities incident to a life of maritime enterprise. Published in the first decade of the 19th century, this ran to 6 volumes and assembled 188 accounts of shipwreck, and was swiftly followed by similar collections such as J.G. Delisle's 3-volume Shipwrecks and Disasters at Sea. You can see the frontispiece here. And a host of other sort of anthologies. There's 3 volumes of a 4-volume set here that if people want to look at, they can also have a look at afterwards. And these anthologies were produced by plundering the now very substantial back catalogue, as it were, of shipwreck chapbooks, and typically adding just a little bit of editorialising around them. And so that's how they're put together, and they then become a publisher's staple in the 19th and early 20th centuries, often being marketed as collections of remarkable shipwrecks, or indeed, as some anthologies' titles put it, popular shipwrecks. A designation which now seems oxymoronic, but I think illustrates the immense fascination exercised by this material. So, people back in the 18th and 19th centuries knew their shipwrecks. There was a lot of stuff about shipwreck for them to read, and as I put it in my title, there was clearly, we can assume, widespread shipwreck literacy, and a general familiarity with many different real-life wrecks. Perhaps only the Titanic has this sort of widespread currency now, but back then there were multiple wrecks which possessed similar fame or notoriety, such as the disasters listed here. And I think it's safe to assume there must be many people like the characters Sol Gills and Walter Gay in Dickens's novel Dombey and Son, who at one point go off into an enormous sort of mutual recitation of famous shipwrecks where they've memorised all the details. Actually, these are fictional wrecks, but they are sharing. It goes on beyond this. There's loads of wrecks. They just bounce the details between them because they're clearly so immersed in this literature. However, if this points on the one hand to extensive factual knowledge about shipwreck among the British population, I'd suggest that those facts were nevertheless often wrapped up in or put to the service of a certain sort of shipwreck mythology. Oh, sorry, I got the wrong way again. Certain sort of shipwreck mythology that arguably fostered a rather skewed perspective on these disasters. We all know from the way the media works today how easy it is to take facts and filter and frame them in ways which create some highly misleading assumptions and narratives. A similar framing and filtering process, I'd argue, was performed by the production mechanisms and agendas that led to there being so many shipwreck accounts circulating in British culture. As will be apparent from my earlier comments, there was a consistent tendency in this material towards sensationalism, towards graphic, lurid details about the horrors and suffering that might occur in a shipwreck. There is a constant grisly fascination with the injuries and indignities that can be heaped on the human body, either in the violence of the wreck itself or in the prolonged agony and objection sometimes endured by shipwreck survivors as they either drifted in an open boat or found themselves washed up on some desolate coastline. There's a similar fascination and constant emphasis on the ease and speed with which people might cast off their normal social constraints when put in extreme situations, becoming animalistic, as in the example at the top there from the Abergavenny wreck, or violent and anarchic, as in this example from John Hawkesworth's account of a narrowly avoided disaster during Captain Cook's first voyage. What's interesting about this Hawkesworth example is that the source he's drawing on for this incident, the Journal of the Expedition's Naturalist, Sir Joseph Banks, doesn't actually mention all these anxieties. Hawkesworth has added them because this is what he thinks a shipwreck is going to lead to, this throwing off of all sorts of command and order amongst the crew. And this is where I think you start to see this sort of master narrative coming in. There's clearly a shared narrative that everyone has that if you don't watch it, everything's going to get out of control, everyone's survival is going to be endangered by anarchy breaking loose and violence. The other end point that people are clearly aware that shipwreck is heading to is, of course, the resort to cannibalism. And again, these are various accounts where you can see authors saying, yeah, you think shipwreck, you think you're hurtling towards cannibalism. And now actually, if you read one of the anthologies, cannibalism is quite rare. It doesn't come up very often at all, but it haunts almost all the accounts. And that's why I think it's an interesting debate about, should we call these myths around shipwreck? This obsession with everything falling apart and heading towards cannibalism doesn't happen very often, but it clearly has a currency that runs beyond its actual occurrence and likelihood. Whether we want to call this a myth or not, what I'm trying to suggest is this is the sort of narrative that many people brought to bear on an image or an idea of shipwreck, the idea that everything was going to fall apart, that it was an all-encompassing nightmare situation in which the whole world would turn upside down. And that's the narrative framing, I think, that you have to think about being put round comparatively restrained shipwreck accounts like the one of the Gloucester, or perhaps ones that hint at it more directly, like Turner's account depiction here. Sure, I'll stop then. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carl. That was fantastic. We'll take questions later at the end, but I'd now like to introduce you to our second speaker, Elsje, Dr. Elsje Vanke Kessel, who is going to be speaking tonight on shipwreck, material culture and the body. And Elsje van Kessel is the senior lecturer in art history at the University of St Andrews. And she's the author of The Lives of Paintings, Presence, Agency and Likeness in Venetian Art of the 16th Century, published in 2017. Elsje specialises in early modern art with a focus on 16th and 17th century southern Europe. Her wide-ranging interests include the mobility of art, collecting and display, materiality and portraiture. She has published widely about these themes in journals such as Art History, Renaissance Studies, and the Journal of the History of Collections. Elsje's scholarship has been supported by the Leverhulme Trust, the Centre Allemand d'Histoire de l'Art, the Gulbenkian Foundation, and the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, amongst others. Elsje is currently also writing a book about art and shipwreck on the early modern seas. So, come on.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Is my microphone working? Can you hear me? Great. Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone, here and online. Thank you so much for the invitation to come to Norwich. Claire, Benjamin, Francesca, and Molly and Sophie for the warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to visit this beautiful town again and to speak to you this evening about early modern shipwreck in relation to art, material culture, and the body. My talk explores some of the lived experiences of shipwreck in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the ways people here in England and also elsewhere in Europe gave meaning to these experiences with and through images and objects. Yes. So take, for example, this small painting by the 17th century marine painter Jan Peters. English and Dutch ships, as well as a galley, are headed for the rocks in what seems to be an imaginary Mediterranean setting. Some passengers are seeking safety in a boat, while detritus floats on the violent waves. The instability of the scene contrasts starkly with the background right of the painting, which shows a castle high and dry on a cliff, bathing in a pleasant sunlight. Although this is not an overtly religious image, through its dramatic light-dark contrast, it allows for an interpretation of the safety of the shore as divine salvation. What then of the bales of cargo that have gone overboard in the foreground? These bales floating in the water contain objects and represent value. In my talk, I focus on them, objects traveling on ships that through the disaster of shipwreck changed course. How do their values change when they are submerged in the waves? And how do humans depend on such shipwrecked objects for survival? In the period of European maritime expansion, large vessels, such as this one, pictured here, carried explorers, crew members, passengers, weaponry, and trade goods across long distances over the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. They carried the standard of those under whose authority they sailed, here the cross of the Order of Christ, a symbol of the Crown of Portugal. When a shipwreck sank to the bottom, such an event, as the exhibition makes very clear in the case of the wreck of the Gloucester, quickly took on greater meaning, and we've heard the same idea in Carl's talk. The wreckage of ocean-faring vessels could turn into a failure of empire. What role did material culture have to play in this process of interpretation? As this 16th century painting shows, the oceans in this period were imagined as an inexhaustible cornucopia of riches. In an imagined island world, corals, shells, and pearls are recovered from the depths of the water. A group of young, naked women display them at their feet and on their bodies. The wealth symbolized through pearls and jewels, with their intimate connections to human bodies, is to be found in the water, ready to be taken by European empire builders. Gemstones, pearls, and the jewels made of them often figure in written accounts of shipwreck, though rarely in visual representations. For this, they are too small. But it is clear they were omnipresent on ocean-faring vessels and circulated continuously. Because of their high monetary value combined with their small size, gems and the jewels made of them were prone to change possession in watery warfare and other maritime disasters. That is, they often changed hands when survival was at stake. The American scholar Josiah Blackmore, who is a leading figure in contemporary critical engagement with early modern shipwreck, argues that in Portuguese narratives of shipwreck, and I'm showing you an illustration from one such shipwreck story, disaster at sea makes the riches carried on early modern ships superfluous. the wet world of the sea has its liquidity in common with money. And indeed, global capitalism's dependence on the ocean has been ongoing. But these two types of liquidity, often connected in sea-based empire, so the liquidity of water on the one hand, the liquidity of money on the other hand, are at odds with one another in this image. When the ship splits and the boundary between the precious cargo and the water falls away, objects turn into flotsam, floating upon the waves from where they might be saved, or sinking forever to the bottom of the ocean. The ship is threatened such that its capsizing shape is hard to distinguish here from rain and the ocean, its mass nearly dissolving into the curly lines that evoke the chaotically breaking waves. Cargo runs over the deck of the ship into the water and loses its value when the ship breaks apart. And in this way, an image of shipwreck, such as this one here, reveals the senselessness of greed. So we are in the years around 1600 here, and it is time that I introduce you a bit further to that precise historical moment. For 2 decades, several European nations had been fighting over influence in the Atlantic Ocean. So Portugal and Spain had been expanding into the Americas, Africa, and Asia since the late 15th century. And from the 1580s onward, England and the United Provinces of the Netherlands, or the Dutch Republic for short, increasingly contested the Iberian monopoly on global maritime trade. And I hope you can see this map. It shows the various trade routes of these European nations. So Portugal, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and England in green. So this period of oceanic warfare needs to be seen against the background of armed battle within Europe. In 1581, after a short period of armed conflict, King Philip II of Spain was crowned as Philip I of Portugal. With relations between England and Spain having deteriorated for decades, the First Anglo-Spanish War broke out in 1585. In the same period, Dutch provinces revolted against Spanish rule, which resulted in an 80 years war. For this and various other reasons, shipwreck was a common occurrence in this period. European ships making their way across the dangerous oceans got caught up in storms, sank because of faulty loading, were caught by enemy nations, or burned by their own crews to prevent their enemies from appropriating them. Shipwreck had profound material consequences. Ships' passengers or other human cargo, I mean slaves, drowned or were randomly disembarked or confiscated as spoils. Objects drifted to unexpected shores, sank to the bottom, or were seized. Ships sank or were captured, diverted, and subsequently held as war trophies. The lived material experience of shipwreck became highly meaningful in the imagination of the European maritime expansion. Richard Hakluyt, the author of the Principal Navigations, articulates the perceived connections between shipwreck, warfare, and material wealth traveling via the ocean when describing the English taking of the Portuguese carrack São Filipe. And here I'm showing you a freight list of the São Filipe in Portuguese that is now in the British Library. So Hakluyt writes, and here, by the way, it is to be noted that the taking of this carrack wrought 2 extraordinary effects in England. First, that it taught others that carracks were no such bugs that they might be taken. And secondly, in acquainting the English nation more generally with the particularities of the exceeding riches and wealth of the East Indies. So Francis Drake and his crew took the São Filipe in the year 1587. And this is also why this list is in the British Library. As Hakluyt makes clear, the ship was the first coming from Asia to have fallen victim to English privateering, and its taking had important consequences. First of all, it showed the English that carracks, the large cargo ships commonly used by the Portuguese between Goa and Lisbon, could be confiscated, no matter how impressive their size. Furthermore, it was the first time Asian goods arrived in England in such concentrations. And I'm showing you here some of the best in terms of sort of artistic value, let's say, that some of these Portuguese ships carried between Asia and Europe. The cargo of the ship demonstrated a variety of objects that originated from this area of the world and the money that could be made with these objects. In a long passage dedicated to the Madre de Deus, which was a ship the English were to capture only 5 years later, in 1592, Hakluyt lists a variety of objects that comprised the cargo. Whereupon good view was found, he writes that the principal wares after the jewels, which are no doubt of great value, though they never come to light, keep this in mind, I will come back to this point, consisted of spices, drugs, silks, calicoes, quilts, carpets, and collars, etc. And then he goes on to specify for each of these categories what kinds of silks, what kind of calicos, what kind of carpets, etc. Then he goes on, the rest of the wares were many in number but less in value, as elephants' teeth, porcelain vessels of China, coconuts, hides, ebon wood as black as jet, bedsteads of the same, clothes of the rinds of trees, very strange for the matter, and artificial workmanship. Hakluyt's account is overtly nationalistic in tone, uninterested in the ethical implications of violently taking ships, people, and objects, and instead exalting the English nation. He does this exactly through listing the objects and goods taken as spoils at length, so that they occupy almost the whole page, and they almost come alive on the page. As we will see later, not all the spoils from the carrack were permanently recovered. Hakluyt's list implies that if the objects are no longer there, words may take their place, recording the unimaginable variety of things the Indies brought forth, exactly as his account replaces and conjures up the material world of a stolen cargo ship. The ship Madre de Deus was taken near the Azores Islands in the northern Atlantic Ocean on the night of the 3rd of August 1592, after a day's fighting. The carrack must have defied every notion that the English had of ships up to that date. As William Drake, who in the middle of the 19th century published an extensive scholarly article about the case, formulates it, the carrack was more like a floating house 7 stories high than any existing specimen of naval architecture. What happened to the Madre de Deus subsequently is a story told many times over. Until the middle of the 20th century, the taking of the ship was a popular episode in nationalist historiography of the British Empire. As the Earl of Cumberland's men began to board the ship, chaos ensued. Despite the bodies of Portuguese casualties filling the decks, it was every man for himself, trying to take whatever could be taken. When John Burroughs, as commander of the fleet, went on board the ship next day, he could barely establish order. And when the ship eventually arrived in Dartmouth Harbour, early in September, the pilfering continued, so that Queen Elizabeth I was compelled to set up a commission to retrieve the embezzled goods, a move that had only limited success. Conflict also arose over the division of the booty, another responsibility of this commission. Elizabeth eventually cashed in the lion's share of the profit. Reconstructing the cargo of a ship like the Madre de Deus is a complex task. The cargoes of ships on the India run, the Portuguese India run, tend by definition to be elusive. Under Portuguese law, anyone on board was permitted to import certain quantities of small goods to keep or sell as they saw fit, out with the Crown's monopoly. There was no requirement to register these, but other goods were also kept off the books. Hustling with cargo was an altogether common practice. As several of the sailors of the ship stated, when they were taken to England and interrogated by the commissioners, every of the said gentlemen and merchants had some jewels, rubies, pearls, and such like, some more, some less, the which they do commonly put in their chests upon the upper decks of the ship, that at their coming home they may the better convey them secretly aland. There are various reasons why cargo would remain off the books, including smuggling and embezzlement. Official freight lists would in no way give a complete picture of what had been stored on board. To make matters even more complicated, the freight list of the Madre de Deus was probably lost at an early stage. The same document just quoted states that the purser of this carrack, which was set ashore, had a book of all the lading of the carrack, but what is become thereof they know not. Perhaps the same happened as with the freight record of the Santiago, another carrack taken by Dutch privateers a few years later. This Portuguese booklet was published about that event. To prevent the enemy sailors from obtaining valuable intelligence, the purser of the vessel tied the list to a porcelain shard and threw it into the waves. In other words, written documents, preserved only fragmentarily, have no one-on-one relation with what was in fact on board, a situation of which not a single individual would have had a clear grasp. When the commissioners appointed by the Queen initiated a hunt for stolen goods across southwest England, plenty of things were found, but it is remarkable that few of these seem to have ended up at Leadenhall, the site in the city of London where the booty from the Carrack was assembled and catalogued, and this document is a result of that exercise. The cargo of the Mater de Deis came to Europe as merchandise, then turned into booty, then into stolen goods, then often into merchandise once more. Instructive in this light are a Portuguese and an English inventory of goods taken from the Carrack by various officials, so I show them side by side here. The Portuguese version on the left was written by a certain Vicente de Fonseca, purser of the Santa Cruz, another ship from the same fleet to which the Mater de Deis belonged. And this Fonseca had been captured and coerced into collaborating. So he drew up this document on the left, and his list mentions a range of objects, most of all items of jewelry and quantities of precious stones that were taken by various English captains. Rings, rubies, pearls, diamonds, but also musk, ambergris, mace, calicos, and silks. One of the highlights was certainly one chest belonging to the captain of Ceylon, the document states, and therein an embroidery for a waistcoat set with diamonds, rubies, and pearls, esteemed with the chest to be worth 20,000 cruzados, Portuguese currency. The set of lists is remarkable for its contrast in terms of presentation. Next to the relatively improvised layout of the Portuguese document, there is the highly organized schema of the English interpretation. The English interpretation of Fonseca's list uses the data provided by the Portuguese guy to construct a complex, visually arresting graphic that can be grasped in a single view. In the first column, on the left, are the names of English captains who had found or confiscated objects with and from certain people and places listed in the second column. So you see this over here, the names and then places. The third column is the dances with information, as you can see, describes all the objects. In the fourth, fifth, and sixth columns, the estimated values of the objects are added up, resulting in a total estimate of over £28,000. With its high degree of visual organization, this document is a good example of how an inventory can translate information about objects found in physical spaces with graphic means. It also forms evidence of the authorities' attempt to assert control over the unpredictable movement of small objects. Yet what happened with the things this list describes so beautifully remains unclear. In the circumstances of shipwreck, gems were not only desired by those victorious, in this case the English, but also by those at risk of losing their lives. Gems belong to a category of objects that often maintain their value amidst the wreckage and offer their possessors salvation. When the ship Santiago, I've already mentioned it, was conquered in 1602 near the island of St. Helena in the southern Atlantic, gems took on their role as life-saving currency. Melchior do Amaral, the official charged with investigating the causes of the loss of this ship, published a compelling account, which we see here. The battered ship, severely damaged from 3 days of gunpowder attacks, is dangerously keeling over, and more passengers attempt to reach scarce lifeboats. Amaral writes, and some who showed them small boxes with jewels, they took on board of the lifeboats. And all the others who attempted to enter, they killed cruelly. When they saw that the enemy took only those who gave them stones, which few had, and killed the others, most people were overcome by the biggest desperation of their lives, and with a sad disconsolation being moved naked beyond the boat's waist, expecting any moment to taste bitter death, they desperately cried for mercy to the enemies who clearly heard them, yet showed them no compassion. So when the ship is going down, pearls, jewels, and precious stones offer the passengers a chance of survival, but those without access to gems are left to perish. The similar sad mechanism was behind another story. The Florentine merchant Francesco Carletti lost his merchandise as a passenger of the same unfortunate carrack, Santiago. In the narrative of his shipwreck, written after his return home, so he made it out alive, Carletti ruminates on the presence of large quantities of gemstones and pearls on board the ship, and his failure to hold on to what was his. In a moment of particular despair, when he thinks he will be left behind on a small island in the middle of the Atlantic, he decides to eat not the body of someone else, but to eat pearls. And it was a good quantity of beautiful, fat pearls, he writes, that had not yet been touched, which I wanted to swallow. But it was not possible to ingest more than 4 or 5, because my throat was still dry and sore from the great suffering of thirst that I underwent in those days when I was kept with the others below decks. So Carletti swallowed pearls to achieve safety at sea, despite the potential risk of damaging the pearls through exposing them to gastric acid. The merchant evidently ingests the small objects to keep them away from others' prying fingers. In the unstable environment of a seized ship, where, as Carletti describes, possession of valuables is temporary and uncertain, swallowing gems is the surest way to keep them out of reach of others. Underlying the temporary merging of pearls and body is the merchant's hope that the liquidity afforded by these precious things can eventually buy its way to safety on the European shore. In stories of the experience of shipwreck, such as Carletti's, gems call the very notion of value into question and show how, at sea, one type of liquidity turns into another. This changing valuation of objects in shipwreck remains a trope in contemporary representations of shipwreck. I was reminded of this when recently watching the first episodes of this new Netflix series called Turn of the Tide, which is set in the Azores Islands. And it centers around a big load of cocaine wrecked and arriving at the island of São Miguel, and in one specific tiny village on this remote island. And cocaine becomes so ubiquitous. You see one of the characters holding a pack of cocaine there. It becomes so ubiquitous for a while in this village that it loses much of its value because of this shipwreck. And in a particularly memorable scene, people start to actually use it not only for what people usually use cocaine for, but also as coffee creamer and to batter their fish. So with that, back to the 17th century now. The shipwreck stories of the Santiago show that at sea, jewels approached bodies in very specific ways. In addition to providing those at risk of drowning with something to trade, jewels were attributed talismanic properties, believed to protect their owners against the dangers of the sea. The Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés reportedly carried 2 ship pendants formed of emeralds, yes, wrapped in a cloth on his belt. Jewelry specialists argue that many such pendants were offered as ex votos to shrines and attached to Catholic cult statues as a way of thanksgiving for shipwreck survived. A connection to the wearer's shipwrecked body has been explicitly recorded in this devotional pendant, which I'm showing you in this bad illustration because I don't know what has come of this jewel. And if anyone in the audience has any idea, I'd be really interested to know. So the jewel was shipwrecked with its owner in the aftermath of the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Around the figure of the Madonna and Child, the inhabitant of Ireland who found this jewel had it inscribed. When Spanish fleet fled home for fear, this golden picture then was found, fast fixed onto a Spaniard's ear, who drowned lay on Irish ground. Through the material change affected by the inscription, the death of the Spanish soldier by drowning made it possible for the jewel to protect someone else. Finally, in stories of shipwreck, stones do not only bring salvation, but also embody the greed that motivates empire like no other type of object. The same Amaral, who recorded the disaster of the Santiago, also writes of an unfortunate sailor of the carrack Santa Clara. When the Santa Clara went down, Amaral recounts, the sailor took so many gold chains and other pieces with him that he sunk to the bottom and immediately lost his life. While his fellow passengers try to swim themselves to shore undressed, the overburdened sailor travels a vertical journey towards his demise. The sailor stands in a metronymic relation to the ship that carried him across the ocean, which in turn is part of the ill-fated enterprise of the Portuguese India Run. On 3 different levels, an excess of material wealth is being carried across the waters in this story, and on each of these levels, the sailor's body, the ship, and the whole enterprise of the India Run, the vehicle breaks down. The lone figure of the sinking sailor represents the intimate connections between body, stones, and ship that characterize the India Run on a larger scale. I'm reaching my conclusion here. Stories of the shipwreck of vessels like the Madre de Deus and the Santiago shed light on the transitory phase of the lives of objects, their transportation from one place to another. Wrecked ships offer a precious glimpse into this liminal moment, which I've argued is precisely a moment when objects underwent a change of value and function. Some, damaged by the salty water, immediately lost all value. Others, salvaged, turned from merchandise into spoil. Still others became lifesavers. Furthermore, wrecked ships, as distinguished from ships that complete their journeys without incident, are particularly revealing not only for their adventures or anecdotal appeal, but also because they tend to be much better documented often than their uneventful counterparts. Precisely because they faced tragedy, left impressive paper trails and material remnants, recording an assemblage of humans and objects on the brink of dispersal. Finally, shipwrecks, both those that are being recovered, like the Gloucester, and those imagined in writings and pictures, show that the presence of material things from the past is not a given, but always a matter of survival, both theirs and of the humans who need them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elsje. If both our speakers would like to come and sit in the front here, we can take some questions from the audience and also from our online audience as well. Claire, seeing as you're in the front.
Thank you both. That was great. Really enjoyed both papers. A question to start. I'll come back to you later. Carl, is that I think you were really good at talking about the different forms in which shipwreck narratives were being, kind of told within the long 18th century. Do you know whether there was a kind of overlap in readership between the poetic form of the shipwreck account, or the chapbook form, or the longer novel form as it goes on? Do you know anything about the people that were consuming these different stories, and whether that, if they got the chapbook, they then went on to get see the whole series?
Sort of, I suppose, in the sense that, there's plenty of evidence that the chapbooks were read by people at all walks of life. So, the chapbooks look like quite cheap things. So they obviously could be read by people quite low down the social scale. But it's also fairly clear that from references and general familiarity with shipwrecks that, upper middle class literary readers were familiar with them. You can see the chapbook material and the anthology material being reworked, for example, by someone like Byron and his Shipwreck in Don Juan. So my impression has always been, I'm hard to give you a particular detail that clinches this as an argument, but my impression has been that everyone was familiar with the chapbooks, so whether they read them in the original chapbook form, or they read them, as I was trying to say, that the chapbook ones then circulated in the magazines, and so on and so forth. So I think one of the things that interests me about that period is that everyone must have known this massive hinterland of incredibly gory shipwreck accounts. But if you ever look at shipwrecks in polite literary forms or in polite art, they almost never reference all that goriness. So I think there's an interesting tension there that those literary representations of shipwreck must have worked in some sort of interesting counterpoint to what everyone knew could go horribly wrong, if you see what I mean. And for some of you may know this already, but it's something like Don Juan's account of a shipwreck, which is a very black comic account of a shipwreck, where all the nasty things that people thought would happen in the master narrative of horrifying shipwreck, Byron puts them in deliberately. And he's very gleeful. He says, every one of these is true. I got every one out of J.G. Delisle. But of course, not all of them happened in the same shipwreck, whereas Byron takes every awful thing that could happen and puts them in one shipwreck. And, you know, so they eat the dog, which is a staple thing. They eat their boots. They eat each other, so on and so forth. And, and they go mad because they've eaten each other. And part of the scandal of that, I think, is very clear, is that you didn't put that sort of horror story in polite literature. Everyone knew about it, but it didn't go into a polite literary text. So I think my guess, I can't really point to evidence, is that there's plenty of evidence. Everyone knew these stories, upper middle class, upper class readers, lower class readers. They politely didn't put them in mainstream literary texts, but they're a sort of, I say, they're there in counterpoint to that.
Yeah, that's
well, thank you.
Yeah. We have no tales of cannibalism, to my knowledge, on Gloucester, but we do have a dog.
I think that would be a bit poor, just off the Norfolk coast, eating each other that close to the
There's a lovely story about a dog that is drowned by one of the surgeons that fights for ownership of a plank. And
that sort of fighting is, even in that, exactly.
In the Merry Rose, the dog that's been recovered is the most popular artefact that is on display. So there's always a shadow dog story.
Right.
Can I ask Carl, communities around our coast, you know, and if we keep it local, just around East Anglia, without sounding accusing anything, a lot of communities, if you like, benefit, might not be perhaps the right word, but the consequences of shipwreck might have been that cargoes came ashore, and even if it was just a crate of oranges, then they would have benefited at that level. Was there accounts written of communities that did, take the cargoes, even in some cases where they might have induced the wrecks, and caused that? And when did the ship owners or the shipping companies try to salvage or get things back? When did that start?
I think attempts, Elsje might salvage, you might know more about salvage sort of regulations than me, but I think there were often attempts to get things back, certainly around the British coast. I think my understanding of it, I'm not a particular expert on this, is that part of the problem is the law is quite blurred in this context. There's quite a lot of things in the aftermath of shipwreck where the laws get blurred, so it's hard to dictate what's going on and who's got rights to things. There's certainly references to people helping themselves, and my understanding is there's certain sort of common local traditions which actually talk about the bounty of the sea. These are communities that have grown up expecting this is part of what you got. Stuff that washed up was yours, some sort of. The stories of people inducing wrecks, my understanding, are largely fictional, it's thought. Catherine Pearce, who works a lot on this, I've been at a conference with her before, she's looked a lot of this in terms of Cornish wrecking, and actually the Cornish wrecking stories in terms of lights and this sort of stuff largely appear, if I remember rightly, sort of late 18th, early 19th century as part of a civilizing, an official metropolitan civilizing mission against the so-called Cornish. And actually there's not a lot of evidence that anyone ever lured a wreck successfully. Partly because I often thought, it's actually quite hard to see how that would work. I've never quite worked out how you're supposed to do that. So I think the idea of them luring people on is now largely thought to be quite mythical. The idea that there were communities that had, where it had come to be seen as a right that they could salvage, I think is true. And I think some of the stories about sometimes then people knocked a few people on the heads when they washed up to make sure they got the salvage are also thought to be true. But the full-blown wrecker myth, I think is now disputed, as far as I'm aware, by a lot of scholars. But there may be people here who know more about me.
Do you have another question at the back there?
Can you hear us all right? Yeah. I thought it was a very interesting talk by both of you. If I could just go on for a little while. I had an uncle of mine, grandparent of mine, that were mariners in charge of ships, and a step-cousin of mine who was on submarines up until recently. And just to start on the Dutch second talk, without going into too many naval secrets, I think even these days, because a lot of ships are confined spaces, there are often one or two people on ships that, say, have one or two more extra objects than they're supposed to. So that when they're short of things, almost it becomes then worth more money. I mean, you'd hope they don't use cocaine as coffee cream or for their fish and chips, but I've heard various stories, and I'm sure people will be more interested in that another time. The second comment was, I thought it was really interesting, the first talk, and the idea almost of these shipwrecks as like a kind of high-end soap opera. Sort of, you know, because I suppose in the day the ships were like the sort of zenith of the country's success, and the idea that although on the face of it they go out the, you know, sort of out of Portsmouth or wherever looking all perfect, and the idea that when they're out at sea in whichever part of the world sometimes things would go horribly wrong. Like, I think it kind of, you know, plays into, you know, it's interesting for me to hear that sort of idea of them being almost like you know, I mean, for a lot of mariners and people who live on coastal communities, there's very much a tradition of oral history and so on and so forth. And I presume with a lot of the locations of the wrecks in those days, when they wouldn't, most, you know, people wouldn't have had access to cartography and mapping and so on, it would be very much kind of word of mouth about the stories, about where the particular locations were and so on and so forth. And, you know, kind of an insight into parts of the world most of them would have known nothing about. Just a final point quickly as well. It was also, I thought it was very interesting, the kind of link that I didn't realise between the ships and religion as well. And just to finally get onto a question, sorry. The idea of I hadn't realised the kind of idea of the link between, you know, the sea at that time, religion and so on, mythology and so on. Would many of the ships have actually had someone like a vicar or priest on board?
I think they often did. Certainly naval ships did, I'm fairly certain.
Yeah.
I would imagine, I wouldn't be surprised if something like a large East Indian. I mean, do you remember the wrecks are going from sort of little fishing boats pushing out of, you know, Great Yarmouth or something? Obviously they wouldn't, but I should imagine a lot of the larger ones, and certainly state-owned ones did. Just quickly to comment on a couple of your comments. You're right about the sort of the element of the people looking up to the ships, because one of the things I always like to stress with this is that they all look incredibly antiquated and wonderful, these old sailing ships to us now, but they were state of the art. You know, they were like spaceships in the day. You know, they were built by the biggest industrial complexes. They had technology that everyone marvelled at. So to have them wrecked so repeatedly was a massive sort of dent to the psyche.
You know, these days when that happens with planes or spacecraft or submersibles,
excuse
or
me,
whatever, it's really
Douglas. Apologies. I think we've got another question further up here, and one here as well. Thanks ever so much. So there's one here, and then a gentleman over there. Have we got any online?
My question is for Elsje. I was really struck. I think it was your very first image, as a fantastic painting of a shipwreck, big storm, and there was a galley on it, which I find quite unusual because most of your case studies were actually sailing vessels. They're carracks. And yet you've got a galley there doing it. Of course, galleys are, you know, Mediterranean vessels largely. They're more used to kind of calm waters. And it struck me as quite unusual, actually, to see a galley in a big storm as a part of a shipwreck. And this kind of also relates to what Carl was saying, because usually when the rev is involved, it can be connected to religion or some sort of like divine providence or something that causes wrecks. But actually, in the Mediterranean, when it's calmer waters, where galleys are more at home because, you know, they can use their oars. I'm guessing most shipwrecks there happen more because of human negligence, failing to see certain obstacles or whatever, rather than perhaps the weather. And I was quite intrigued because in your case studies, they had various vessels from the Iberian coast, and where they're being wrecked is further north. It's not around their own shores often it's happening. So I guess it was coming to my kind of question. Was there a difference in the kind of northern and southern European perception of shipwrecks, in that were southern European usually perceived more as human negligence because the weather was usually a bit better, whereas in the Atlantic and north, is it more typical for them to kind of blame bigger ideas, bigger powers for causing it? Does that make sense? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and quite a big question too. That isn't very straightforward to answer, I think, in just a minute. But I think what you really see in these sources from Portugal that I've talked about is definitely a strong religious component. So where the wreckage is seen as in a sense, a punishment from God, but also sort of process through which the nation needs to go through, then find salvation. Whereas some of the other material that I talked about is much more straightforward and businesslike, is trying to recover objects, and these are British sources, for instance, and they don't talk about God, they're just interested in who took these jewels and where are they now. So it's a very different kind of, it depends really on what kind of material you study really, like literary sources will sooner find causes like religious causes, whereas the stuff you find in archives will more talk about like the very hands-on practical monetary value, etc. I was reminded with a question from the back about religion, also about material I'm interested in, about how religious objects could function differently for Protestants and Catholics and become contested within the battles of religion, the wars of religion that are raging through Europe in the 17th century. So particular very precious cross being carried by someone at sea, for instance, being not taken by Dutch pirates because they think it's only a stupid religious object, Catholic object, and then the Catholic owner being like, ha ha ha, these stupid Dutch Protestants, not recognizing the monetary value of this thing, which was composed of diamonds, etc. And they didn't see it because they only saw the cross shape and were like, no, we don't want it. So yeah, fascinating.
I'm very aware of time. I think we've probably got time for just one more question. It is 25 past, so if we can just take the question from this gentleman here.
Okay, I better make this a good question, hadn't I? I'm interested in the idea of these narrators that were, if you were producing rushing out a chapbook or something, you'd want to get a good first-person account. Who would your preferred narrator be if you were trying to nab someone for your pamphlet? What, did they go for the vicar? Did they go for the captain? Someone else? And did these people become celebrities in their own right?
Celebrities, they became well known. So the authors became because of the disputes that followed. So there's a lot of people who knew the big names. I think you see people from pretty much all ranks that were literate. So that's sort of usually from sort of warrant petty officer upwards. Get called it. There's a chance to put your story out. The other perspective on that, which I didn't mention, of course, is it's a way for the shipwreck victim, the shipwreck survivor, to make some money as well. So they're cashing in as well as the printer is posting in. And the impression I got is, often there's a usually fairly official account rushed out, which tends to exonerate the sort of captain, and then usually there's someone taking issue with it and thinking, actually, I can make some money by saying, actually, the captain messed up. And so it's sort of the natural dynamic of it is it for to splinter opinions like that. So yeah, people all ranks, actually, reasonable ranks at the literate level get represented in this, which is also quite interesting because it's, this is still a period where, by and large, you're sort of upper class or upper middle class if you're involved in the writing of publishing of books. So it's an interesting genre where you get some more slightly sort of middle order voices.
I think it is now 26 past 7. I think we're going to have to leave it there. Apologies if anybody else had some questions to ask this evening. And yeah, once again, I apologise on behalf of the castle that our staffing issues went awry this evening, which means we're having to finish earlier than we'd hoped. The one point that one really gets is that a shipwreck was in past centuries were the most catastrophic, when anarchy might occur, from people eating each other to eating pearls to eating dogs. And it's the most wildly topsy-turvy set of events that people might not hope to find themselves in. It makes our Gloucester shipwreck story seem quite tame, really. No cannibalism, no pearl eating, as far as we know. Although, of course, we haven't found any precious metal on board yet. So maybe somebody was nibbling a silver dish in the midst of the shipwreck or something like that. You never know. Exactly, yes. But thank you. May I thank our speakers very much indeed. Thank you.